How many of you this week looked at your children, if you have them, and thought, what is this nation, this Britain, we have created for you? I know I certainly did. Not just as the father of a teenage son, not much younger than Henry Nowak, but as a journalist who's seen our system of justice warped beyond recognition by a fiction that racism is only ever a one-way street, a fiction which, for years, and to my shame, I failed to question with the bravery we are called upon to show. There will be those made uncomfortable with the way Henry Nowak's murder has become a punctuation mark in the evolving and tortuous story of race relations in Britain. Some have pointed to the words of his father, who stressed with infinite dignity that his son's death should not be weaponized for the purposes of division. And watching that family's agonies play out in real time on the courtroom steps in Southampton, it is important that in teasing out what one murder means for society at large, we do not forget the loss that's been endured by a family. But it is also true that some events and the reaction to them cannot be, should not be, circumscribed by a family's sorrow, no matter how raw. And I would argue the murder of Henry Nowak is one such event. The principles at stake affect us all because the police serve all of us. I apologise if this sounds callous, but politicians who invoke the family's name as a means of stifling legitimate debate should not be allowed to stop us from having the candid conversations we need to have right now. Leaving questions of race and policing to a magic circle of those in the know is one of the reasons we've ended up where we are. By now, I assume you'll be familiar with Henry's story, so I won't be going over what happened on December the 3rd last year in any detail, nor will I be airing the footage of his final moments. I've seen it once, and once, as I'm sure you'll agree, is enough. Let me start by saying this. The man who murdered Henry Nowak, Vikram Digwa, will spend decades behind bars. But the man who, in a sense, created the conditions in which his death happened in the way it did, has escaped any kind of reckoning. Because he died 5 years ago. Who and what am I talking about? Well, think back to the very early days of New Labour. Tony Blair I'm pretty certain he didn't, set out to ruin Britain, but he left behind a succession of ideological landmines that took decades to detonate, and they are still going off. Policies on immigration, university expansion, devolution, equalities, you know about them. But the one thing, looking back, which I think we can say changed everything without anybody particularly noticing, happened within weeks of Blair coming into office. In July 1997, Blair's Home Secretary, Jack Straw, good man in many ways, ordered an inquiry into the fatal stabbing of a young black man called Stephen Lawrence. His vicious murder, while undoubtedly a vile crime, became the catalyst for several insidious changes in our laws. And for that, we have one person to thank. Sir William Macpherson, a courtly, upright, retired High Court judge, was appointed to draw lessons from the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And the lessons he drew, well-intentioned at the time, have proved, if not to be our undoing, then a very serious impediment to social cohesion. William Macpherson died in 2021 at the ripe age of 94, but almost 30 years on from publication of the report which bears his name, the institutional racism he sought to stamp out has simply been rammed into reverse. Henry Nowak is its latest and most high-profile victim. What was it about Macpherson's 70 official findings which rendered it so toxic and ultimately self-defeating? The big problem was that it redefined racism, making it incredibly subjective. Macpherson said a racist incident was any incident which is perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person. Note the word victim, not complainant or witness, but victim. In other words, no presumption of innocence or guilt. If someone thinks they're a victim of racism, they are, period. No duty to establish the facts or get over an evidential bar. If you think the person who's clouted you was also motivated by the colour of your skin, then you are to be believed. In practice, What did this do? The first thing it did was, because Macpherson called the police institutionally racist because of how they mishandled the death of a black teenager, the idea that a white person could be a victim of racism wasn't really considered. The other thing it did was to insinuate itself into almost every aspect of official life. Yes, police chief constables queued up to denounce their own forces as institutionally racist, but then so did bits of the NHS and the civil service. It even fed into the idea of non-crime hate incidents. It didn't matter if a crime couldn't be proven. If perceived bigotry was a factor, then Plod was interested. Police became sociologists, setting aside common sense in favour of dogma, and from there it was one small step to two-tier policing and treating victims preferentially depending on how much skin pigment rather than guilt they possessed. Once the symbol of fairness in our criminal justice system could be found in countless statues up and down the land of Lady Justice blindfolded, sometimes with scales in one hand to symbolise the careful weighing of evidence. What would it be now, I wonder? For me, it was photographs of those tremulous police officers in the early days of the Black Lives Matter protests, uncertain whether they should take the knee, as they were being encouraged to. A few did, others opted to remain detached and impartial, like bobbies used to be back in the olden days. The image summed up how confused the people we consent to be policed by and whose wages we are compelled to pay had become when it comes to the vexed question of race. How many victims have been produced by this asymmetrical policing produced by the Macpherson Report? We have absolutely no idea. But I can tell you they include those young white girls predated upon by Pakistani grooming gangs rather than being protected by officers who were too busy looking over their shoulders at the Macpherson-inspired spectre of institutional racism. Other victims of Macpherson's reforming zeal are less obvious but no less real. A culture was created where nobody in authority wanted to be guilty of racism, perceived or otherwise. It was there when a security guard missed the chance to stop Salman Abedi before he blew up 22 mainly young girls at the Manchester Arena, lest he be accused of racism. It was there too when a head teacher was ordered to remove the word sinister from the education plan of Axel Rudakabana by mental health professionals who said he mustn't be racially profiled as a black boy with a knife. He went on to stab 3 girls in Southport. It was definitely there when Valdo Calacane walked free from medical custody because those examining him were worried about the overrepresentation of black males in detention. He went on to stab 2 students and a 65-year-old caretaker to death in Nottingham. And it was presumably not far from the thoughts of those lawyers who drafted sentencing guidelines blocked last year at the very last moment when people realised it would mean the same crime involving longer or shorter prison sentences depending on a perpetrator's race or religion. What Macpherson did is now deeply, deeply embedded in our laws and institutions. It is the foundational moment for a whole way of looking at race relations in Britain. If you work in the public sector, the arts, the media, teaching, it's philosophy that racism is subjectively measurable without being objectively provable is there in the HR PowerPoint presentations, the DEI quotas, and we now realise the police's race action plan of 2025. Again, it's important to stress that back in 1997, asking Macpherson to come out of retirement and frame a response to the racist murder of a black man seemed to Labour politicians what that party, then in the process of morphing from being the party of the white working class to one standing for metropolitan liberals, was actually for. Here was a crime that had, with some justification, become a cause célèbre for the left and anti-racism groups. But Macpherson, a nuanced practitioner of the law, also created the conditions, laid the groundwork really, for people less careful with words and thoughts and deeds. The army of race grifters who emerged from the woodwork here in Britain when the Black Lives Matter movement of America grew a British limb in 2020. There is almost, or at least I hope there is, a sense of embarrassment from most people, some people now at least, about how they lost their heads that summer following the killing of an American 4,000 miles from these shores in Minneapolis. Sad to say, all over the world on this globe of 8.3 billion people, there will always be bad cops, and I suspect that somewhere today, in one of the sprawling megacities of Africa or Central America or India, there will be a policeman behaving very badly right now, far away from body cams and the disapproving reports of Western human rights groups and all the other things that cramp the style of corrupt bullies with a uniform, a badge and a gun. So what on earth was it about the death of one man on another continent that led to a massive reaction in Britain, that led protesters on British streets to confront police with the words, "Don't shoot," even though our police are still almost uniquely unarmed? Why did our MPs hold a minute's silence and emergency debates about a crime committed in a country over which our legislators have no control, over laws they cannot vote on? What was it that made Test match cricketers, Premier League referees and Church of England bishops, for heaven's sake, take the knee in a performative display of virtue signalling that gave credence to a body, BLM, that is now utterly discredited? This was an organisation, don't forget, that wanted to abolish prisons and defund the police. Statues were pulled down, Facebook pages blacked out, and TV presenter lapels left misshapen by those little BLM badges. If you didn't go along with it, you were deemed suspect. You were not an ally. Silence suddenly and improbably became a form of violence. What a strange, hysterical time it was. At Sky TV, where the corporate executives, I saw them, flapped around like headless chickens, staff were invited, the word suggests you could say no, to unconscious bias courses. There was a kind of mania in the air that called to mind the words of W.B. Yeats when he wrote that things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, because the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yes, there have been violent protests this week about Henry Nowak, but on a scale incomparable to those in the wake of the George Floyd killing. There are no vast crowds yelling, "No justice, no peace." No company's changing its logo. Nobody's burning the Union Jack at the cenotaph or defacing Churchill's statue. There are no calls to change street names. Henry Nowak may have been killed after a night out with his football teammates, but don't expect England's overpaid footballers to take the knee at the World Cup. But there is, I think, a quiet revulsion about what happened, a dignified restraint that you could hear in the voice of Henry Nowak's father when he recalled his son telling police 9 times that he couldn't breathe, telling them 4 times that he'd been stabbed. The parallels between the killing of George Floyd and the death of Henry Nowak should not exist. If this were a rational country, if its mainstream media weren't in hock to a Western liberal groupthink, if its weather-vane politicians weren't blown around like chaff, then we couldn't possibly see any echoes between a death in police custody in America, I repeat, 4,000 miles away, where they do things very differently, and a violent death in police custody on our own doorstep. We wouldn't be thinking, as we were this week, that Henry Nowak gasping to police that he couldn't breathe reminds us of what we were told again and again, day after day, week after week, was what had happened to a man called George Floyd, about whom, frankly, we ought to know very little, but whom in reality we know about too much. We didn't ask to make any associations between these two very different individuals. We were taught to. We were taught to. By grievance mongers, race grifters, NGOs, axe-grinding MPs, frightened corporate and charity sector bosses, and the mainstream media. They created a sensibility, a prism through which we now are ordered to look at the world, through the lens of race. Through the lens of race. They've taken the idea of structural racism built by the likes of Macpherson, and in the decades since, have turned it into a skyscraper of disgruntlement. I remember thinking, as the George Floyd self-flagellation roadshow rolled on and on, what would happen when the shoe inevitably found its way onto the other foot? Because the point about George Floyd is that it was a story only made possible by the miniaturization of cameras and computers. People on the sidewalk in Minnesota filmed what happened in the neighborhoods on their smartphones and uploaded it to the world. It seemed obvious then that eventually, in America certainly, but here too, footage would soon emerge of a violent act of racial bias superintended by the police, in which this time the victim was not black, but white. Because for all that the Macpherson Report here in the UK seemed to suggest otherwise, racism is a human universal. It's a very unfortunate and regrettable part of the human condition, but it is, sadly, as old as the hills and eternally prevalent. Would that it were not. Our own version of George Floyd, Henry Nowak, didn't have his final moments filmed by the smartphones of bystanders, but by the tiny body-worn cameras of police officers. But the effect was the same. To put the final moments of a life that is about to end into an emotive video clip, and to put that clip into the context of racial bias. That we have that body cam footage was not a given, by the way, where it left to mainstream politicians and their media stool pigeons. I doubt it would ever have come to light. But thanks to Twitter and Musk and Zia Youssef and Alison Pearson and Dan Wootton and Paul Embry and all the people who now make up the alternative universe of news provision, it became impossible for the police not to release the footage. Just as it's become impossible as this week rolled on for the government to insist that the police race action plan can exist in its current form any longer. Keir Starmer has condemned Nigel Farage for politicising the Henry Nowak murder. This is the same Keir Starmer who took the knee in his office for George Floyd. Wasn't that politicising a death in police custody? Not for the first time, our Prime Minister has been made to look like a raging hypocrite. He seems to lack that instinct for learning not to do things because one day they might come back and bite him on the backside. Farage was right to say white lives matter just as much as black lives do. What's controversial about that statement? As usual, the mainstream media failed to understand a fundamental truth, that reform was reflecting anger, not stirring it. Because if our politicians don't connect with what Nigel Farage correctly called the pure, cold rage of the British people right now, then they will find other leaders very far from the middle ground, who do. This week has been an object lesson in how our establishment seeks to manage a story. They start by hoping it never generates much traction or interest at all. Then they hide behind process, usually a long drawn-out inquiry of some kind, or a grieving family. And then, when none of that works, they blame the far right for being opportunists, hijacking a worthy cause for nefarious purposes. If there are violent protests, as there were indeed this week in Southampton, then the demonstrators become a symbol of extremism, as if a few dozen men hurling abuse and bins at police are representative of the millions who have grave misgivings about where the Henry Nowak scandal takes us as a society. Let us not forget that so much of this is about how the media frames things. In 2020, you might remember how the BBC talked about a BLM protest here in the UK. It resulted in 26 police officers being injured, and the BBC called that protest mainly peaceful. The BBC's coverage of the Henry Nowak story this week has been similarly lamentable. The corporation lives in fear of a reform government in 2029 and the end of the obligatory licence fee, which insulates its appallingly one-sided journalism from the corrective effects of market forces. But I'll say one thing for the BBC this week. This was the week when our national broadcaster finally had to acknowledge, grudgingly, reluctantly, with teeth gritted, that there is such a thing out there in the Britain beyond London which amounts to a form of anti-white racism. You can hear it in the voices of their presenters. They don't want to go where this story is taking them. But that they've been forced to cover this story in depth, not least by Nigel Farage, is, I suppose, progress of a kind. I can't finish without addressing the other question, substantive question raised by Henry Nowak's killing, the question of whether Sikhs deserve their special exemption to legally carry a ceremonial knife. I have a particular respect, even affection, for Sikhism. I visited the Golden Temple in Amritsar, their spiritual home. More importantly, I grew up with Sikhs in Yorkshire. I went to a school in Bradford that was maybe 60% white. The other pupils were either Sikhs or Pakistani Muslims. I had no close Pakistani friends because they were, self-segregating? I don't know. Couldn't say. But I did have good friends who were Sikhs. And as the years have gone by, I've noticed, perhaps you've noticed too, that of Britain's immigrant communities, few have done more to integrate than this country's Sikhs. In Bradford, they really stood out. They did the jobs other immigrants from the Indian subcontinent seemingly wouldn't. They worked as plumbers and builders. They drank in the pubs. Years later, long after I'd left Bradford, I remember taking a TV crew to cover floods on the Somerset levels. You may remember them. I was in a car park editing a piece when a van driven by Sikhs carrying water and food for the locals pitched up. For Sikhs, charity isn't just something you give to your co-religionists. Whether it's serving in the British Army or simply drinking in your local boozer, Sikhs are a shining example of how immigration can benefit all of us. So, should Sikhs still be allowed to carry ceremonial knives? You will have your own view. I think they should. Not as a reward for being good migrants, though that does their cause no harm, but because we've got to stop, as a culture, taking one example of misbehaviour, in this case tragically so, as a stick to beat everyone with. It's why we shouldn't ban shotgun ownership, just because one rogue shotgun owner goes on a shooting spree. If there are more attacks with ceremonial knives, maybe we think again, but right now, no ban. I said I didn't want to dwell on the Henry Nowak body cam footage, save for this. That still image taken from the recording of his bloodless hand, cuffed by police wearing blue plastic gloves, is the most extraordinarily powerful, poignant and evocative image which deserves, as it has done, to go around the world. It is a reminder of how the tectonic plates of democracy are in motion, because time was, images like that were only ever co-opted by the left. Now, they belong to the right. They speak to the right. The handcuffing of Henry Nowak is an awful emblem for the ages. It captures so many things simultaneously. For one, it's hard not to think of a young man, first of his family to go to university, bleeding to death, calling for help, listening, if he could still hear, to the lies of someone who should have called an ambulance, not the police, to who they then told a web of lies about a racist attack. It's hard not to think of the words of the police officer who, listening to those lies, says, "I know, but we have to check, don't we?" As the officers finally look to see if Henry Nowak has actually been, as he repeatedly says he has been, stabbed. But we have to check, don't we? These are not words of common sense policing, but of a police force that thinks in terms of compliance, of arse covering, not conscience. I do have some sympathy for the police, and I know some people have none, but going into a confused situation at night is never going to be easy. But what stands out, as so many people who have never served, and some who have pointed out, is the want of scepticism, because it's been bred out of them. The police, you would think, should enter a crime scene equipped with what they need: radios, body cameras, first aid kits, stab vests. Most of all, the most important thing, a sceptical eye. Because these officers were steeped in a culture which punishes anyone who deviates from the protocols of anti-racism policing practice. And because of that, they could not see, they refused to see, a truth that dared not speak its name. That the person who was claiming to have been a victim of racism was, in fact, a murderer, and that the true victim, whose life was ebbing before them, before their eyes, whose pleas for mercy could scarcely be heard, was the last person who deserved to be handcuffed. I always felt that the image of Keir Starmer taking the knee would come back and haunt him. Like those police officers crouching over Henry Nowak's crumpled body, he showed a want of scepticism. He lacked that sixth sense that would have told him that the mania for Black Lives Matter would pass, that he was being driven by a mob mentality, exactly what Starmer now says is happening in Southampton. Like all hypocrites, he's lost the authority to lecture us about anything. I was going to start this piece by reflecting on how it made me feel, watching the footage of Henry Nowak bleeding to death, a young man not much older than my own son. How it made me feel watching his father talk about his darling boy, whose hand he'd just held for the last time at the mortuary. But then as the week wore on, I heard government minister after minister, MP after MP talk about how upset they were about Henry Nowak because they had a son or knew somebody's son. And I realised this kind of empty empathy has no place here. Nigel Farage was right. This is a time for pure, cold rage. When an innocent dying man is handcuffed, and the last thing he hears are the police reading his rights, things are falling apart, and the centre cannot hold. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.